The morning sun blazed white over downtown Atlanta, turning the glass towers into pillars of fire. Heat shimmered off the concrete plaza in front of the Fulton County Courthouse, distorting the figures of journalists and camera crews already gathered at 7:45 in the morning. Lieutenant Sarah Collins stepped out of the unmarked cruiser and felt the humidity wrap around her like a second skin. Beside her, Max dropped to the pavement with practiced silence, his amber eyes already scanning the crowd with the focus of a predator assessing terrain. Sarah adjusted her tactical vest and checked her radio. The call had come in 40 minutes ago. A credible threat phoned into the district attorney's office, voice distorted, message clear. If the trial of Marcus Webb proceeded as scheduled, someone would die inside that courtroom. The threat assessment team had scrambled, and Sarah's K-9 unit had been pulled from a routine training exercise to provide additional security sweep capabilities. Max was the best detection dog in the Atlanta Police Department. 7 years of flawless service, hundreds of successful operations. If there was something hidden in that courthouse, he would find it. She led Max through the security checkpoint at the side entrance, nodding to the uniformed officers who stepped aside to let them pass. The marble floors of the courthouse gleamed under fluorescent lights, footsteps echoing in the cavernous lobby. Lawyers in expensive suits hurried past, clutching briefcases and speaking urgently into phones. The air conditioning fought a losing battle against the Georgia heat seeping through the massive windows, and Sarah could feel sweat forming along her hairline beneath her tightly pulled bun. Deputy Chief Morrison met her at the elevator bank, his face drawn with the particular tension of a man caught between political pressure and operational reality. He was a tall man with silver temples and the permanently exhausted expression of someone who spent more time in meetings than on the street. Sarah had worked with him for 6 years, trusted his judgment in most things. But she could see something else in his eyes today, something that looked almost like fear. The Webb trial had consumed Atlanta for 8 months. Marcus Webb, former chief financial officer of Meridian Construction Group, stood accused of orchestrating the largest public corruption scheme in the city's history. Hundreds of millions in fraudulent billing, kickbacks to city officials, building inspections falsified, safety standards ignored. 3 construction workers had died when a parking structure collapsed 18 months ago, and the investigation that followed had cracked open a web of corruption that reached into City Hall, the police department, and the judicial system itself. Webb was the first domino, the prosecution's foothold into the larger conspiracy. If he went down, he would take others with him, powerful others who had every reason to ensure he never testified. Morrison briefed her as they rode the elevator to the 4th floor. The threat had specified the main courtroom, mentioned explosives, mentioned the star witness by name. Daniel Mercer, former senior accountant at Meridian, had turned state's evidence 6 months ago after prosecutors offered him immunity in exchange for his testimony. He had been in protective custody ever since, moved between safe houses. His family relocated to an undisclosed location. Today was supposed to be his moment, the day he would take the stand and deliver the evidence that would bury Marcus Webb and everyone connected to him. Sarah listened without interrupting, her hand resting lightly on Max's head. The dog sat perfectly still at her side, but she could feel the subtle vibration of alertness running through his muscles. He knew something was coming. He always knew. The courtroom was larger than most, designed to accommodate high-profile trials and the media circus that accompanied them. Dark wood paneling covered the walls, and a massive seal of the state of Georgia hung behind the judge's bench. The gallery was already half filled with reporters, spectators, and what Sarah immediately recognized as plainclothes security personnel attempting to blend in. She counted at least 4 federal marshals positioned near the exits, their suits slightly too bulky to be anything other than concealed carry. She unclipped Max's leash and gave him the search command. a single syllable in German that sent him moving through the courtroom in a precise grid pattern. His nose worked constantly, sampling the air, checking under seats, around the witness stand, behind the jury box. Sarah followed at a distance, watching his body language for any indication of a find. The journalists tracked the dog with their cameras, sensing a story, but Sarah ignored them. Her focus was entirely on Max. He cleared the main floor in 12 minutes, methodical and thorough. Nothing. Sarah felt a small measure of relief, but it was tempered by experience. The absence of explosives did not mean the absence of threat. She directed Max toward the gallery, moving up the center aisle between rows of wooden benches. The spectators shifted nervously as the dog passed, some pulling their bags closer, others leaning away as if afraid of contamination. Max paid them no attention, his nose sweeping left and right with mechanical precision. Then he stopped. Third row from the back, right side. A man in a grey suit sat perfectly still, hands folded in his lap, usis fixed forward, as if watching an invisible performance. He was unremarkable in every way, mid-40s, average build, brown hair greying at the temples. The kind of man you would pass on the street without a second glance, but Max had frozen in place, his entire body locked in a rigid point, muscles quivering with barely contained energy. His eyes were fixed on the man's chest, and Sarah knew with absolute certainty that something was wrong. She approached slowly, her hand moving to rest on her holstered weapon. The man did not turn to look at her, did not acknowledge her presence in any way. His breathing remained steady, his posture relaxed. But there was something artificial about his stillness. It was the calm of someone who had made peace with a terrible decision. Sarah was 3 feet away when Max lunged. The dog moved with explosive speed, 70 pounds of muscle and training launching across the narrow space between benches. His jaws clamped onto the man's right forearm, just as the man's hand emerged from his jacket pocket, clutching a small black device. The impact drove both of them into the bench behind, wooden frame cracking under the force. Screams erupted from the gallery as spectators scrambled for the exits, chaos spreading through the courtroom like fire through dry grass. Sarah drew her weapon and closed the distance in 2 steps, planting her knee on the man's chest and pinning him to the bench while Max maintained his grip on the arm. The black device had clattered to the floor, and she could see now that it was a detonator, simple design, single button protected by a flip cover that had not yet been opened. Whatever he had been planning to do, Max had stopped him before he could do it. Federal marshals converged from all directions, weapons drawn, shouting commands that overlapped into meaningless noise. Sarah kept her focus on the man beneath her, searching his face for some indication of his purpose. His expression was blank, utterly without emotion, and when he finally spoke, his voice was flat and mechanical. He said only one word: Mercer. They cleared the courtroom in under 4 minutes, evacuating spectators and journalists through emergency exits, while the bomb squad was summoned to sweep the building. The man in grey was taken into custody by federal agents, his identity still unknown, his silence absolute. He had not resisted after Max took him down, had not attempted to flee or fight. He simply went limp, allowing himself to be handcuffed and removed as if the outcome no longer mattered to him. Sarah found a quiet corner near the judge's chambers and knelt beside Max, running her hands over his body to check for injuries. The dog was panting from exertion, but otherwise unharmed, his tail wagging slowly as she praised him in the low, warm voice she reserved for moments like this. He had saved lives today. How many, she could not say, but the detonator in that man's pocket had been connected to something, and whatever it was no longer going to explode. Deputy Chief Morrison appeared at her side, his face pale beneath its bureaucratic composure. "The trial has been suspended," he said. "Judge Whitmore is in her chambers with the prosecution team, and Mercer is asking for you." Sarah looked up sharply. For me specifically, Morrison nodded. He said he saw what happened, said he needs to talk to the officer with the dog, something about changing his testimony. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Changing his testimony. The entire prosecution rested on Daniel Mercer's willingness to tell the truth about what he had witnessed at Meridian Construction. Without his testimony, Marcus Webb would walk free, and everyone he had bribed, threatened, or corrupted would remain untouchable. If Mercer recanted now, after everything that had been sacrificed to protect him, the case would collapse. She followed Morrison through a maze of corridors to a small conference room that had been hastily converted into a temporary holding area. 2 federal marshals stood guard outside the door, and a third was positioned inside, watching over a slight man in an expensive suit who sat hunched at the conference table with his head in his hands. Daniel Mercer looked nothing like the photograph Sarah had seen in the case file. In those images, he had been confident, well-groomed, a successful accountant at the peak of his career. The man before her now was hollow-eyed and trembling, his hair disheveled, his tie loosened as if he had been choking on it. He looked up as Sarah entered, and his eyes went immediately to Max. The dog stood calmly at her side, tongue lolling, posture relaxed now that the immediate threat had passed. Mercer stared at him for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, and then he spoke in a voice that cracked with exhaustion. "You stopped him," he said. "The man with the detonator. Your dog stopped him." Sarah nodded but said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence often drew out more information than questions. Mercer's hands were shaking as he placed them flat on the table. "I was watching," he continued, "when your dog went for him. I was sitting 3 rows behind, and I saw everything. The way the dog just knew, the way he moved before anyone else even realized something was wrong. And I thought, that is what loyalty looks like. That is what it means to protect someone." He laughed then, a brittle sound that held no humor. "I have not been loyal to anyone in years. I have been too busy protecting myself." Sarah pulled out a chair and sat across from him, keeping Max close at her side. The dog watched Mercer with alert but calm attention, reading the man's emotional state with an instinct that went beyond training. "Mr. Mercer," Sarah said quietly, "I understand you want to change your testimony." Mercer's eyes darted to the door, to the federal marshal standing in the corner, and then back to Sarah. "Not change," he said. "Expand." The word hung in the air between them. Sarah felt the hairs on the back of her neck rise, a primal warning that she had learned never to ignore. "What do you mean, expand?" Mercer leaned forward, dropping his voice to barely above a whisper. The man with the detonator was not alone. He was a distraction, a sacrifice. Someone wanted me to see him get caught, wanted me to think the threat was neutralized. But I know who sent him, Lieutenant. I know because I saw her in the courtroom today. She was sitting in the front row, right behind the prosecution table, watching me with a smile on her face, and that smile told me everything I needed to know. Sarah's mind raced through the faces she had catalogued during the security sweep. The front row behind the prosecution had been occupied by legal assistants, family members of the victims, and a handful of authorized observers. She could picture them now, trying to match Mercer's description to any of the women she had seen. "Who?" she asked. Mercer's face contorted with something between terror and resignation. "Her name is Victoria Chen. She is the managing partner at Foster & Associates, one of the most powerful law firms in the Southeast. She is also the person who introduced me to Marcus Webb 15 years ago, the person who recruited me into the scheme, the person who has been feeding information about my location to people who want me dead." The revelation struck Sarah with the force of a physical blow. Foster & Associates was one of the most respected firms in Atlanta, its partners regularly appearing in society pages and political fundraisers. Victoria Chen herself was a fixture of the city's elite, serving on charity boards and hosting galas that raised millions for causes ranging from education to environmental conservation. The idea that she could be connected to the Meridian corruption scandal was almost impossible to believe. Almost. Sarah had been a cop long enough to know that the most dangerous predators were often the ones hiding in plain sight, camouflaged by wealth and respectability. If Mercer was telling the truth, then the conspiracy extended far beyond Marcus Webb and his construction company. It reached into the very heart of Atlanta's power structure, into the legal profession that was supposed to uphold justice, into the social circles that defined who mattered and who did not. "Why did not you say any of this before?" she asked. "You have been in protective custody for 6 months. You have spoken to prosecutors, federal agents, everyone. Why wait until now?" Mercer's shoulders sagged. "Because I was afraid. Because Victoria has connections everywhere, including inside the prosecutor's office. I did not know who I could trust. And because she has my daughter." The room seemed to freeze around those final words. Sarah felt Max shift beside her, the dog responding to the sudden spike in tension that radiated from everyone present. The federal marshal took a step forward, hand moving toward his radio, but Sarah held up a hand to stop him. "Explain," she said. Mercer's voice broke as he spoke. "My daughter Emily is 17. She is supposed to be at a boarding school in Massachusetts, safe with my wife and her security detail. But 3 days ago, I received a photograph. Emily at a coffee shop in Atlanta, smiling at the camera, like she did not know she was being watched. And on the back of the photograph, in Victoria's handwriting, 3 words. Remember our arrangement." Sarah's jaw tightened. "What arrangement?" "The arrangement where I testify only to what they want me to testify to, where I give them Marcus Webb and pretend that is where the conspiracy ends, where I protect Victoria and everyone above her, and in exchange, my daughter stays alive." The scope of the situation began to crystallize in Sarah's mind. The threat called into the district attorney's office, the man with the detonator, Mercer's sudden desire to expand his testimony. It was all connected, a complex web of manipulation designed to control the outcome of the trial. Someone had wanted to remind Mercer of the price of disobedience while simultaneously demonstrating that even a failed assassination attempt could not protect him. The message was clear. No one could keep him safe. Not the federal marshals, not the prosecutors, not even the K-9 officer whose dog had stopped a bombing. But Mercer had seen something in Max's action that changed his calculus. He had seen loyalty, devotion, the willingness to risk everything to protect another being. And it had awakened something in him that 6 months of protective custody had failed to reach. Sarah made a decision in that moment, one that would change the course of the next 24 hours. She reached down and placed her hand on Max's head, feeling the warmth of his fur beneath her fingers. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I am going to ask you some questions, and I need you to answer them honestly. Not for the prosecutors, not for the federal marshals, for me, because if what you are telling me is true, then this is bigger than any trial, and the only way we're going to stop it is by working together." Mercer met her eyes, and for the first time since she had entered the room, she saw something other than fear in his gaze. It was hope, fragile and uncertain, but real. "What do you want to know?" Sarah began with the photograph. When exactly had it arrived? How had it been delivered? Was there any indication of where Emily might be now? Mercer answered each question with the careful precision of an accountant, providing details that painted a picture of meticulous planning and total surveillance. The photograph had been slipped under the door of his safe house, meaning someone on the inside had been compromised. The coffee shop in the image was a popular spot in Midtown, less than 2 miles from the courthouse, and his daughter was supposed to have left for Massachusetts a week ago, but a call to the boarding school had confirmed that she never arrived. the realization that Emily Mercer was somewhere in Atlanta, being held as leverage by people with unlimited resources and no moral constraints, focused Sarah's mind with laser intensity. She could see the same realization dawning on the federal marshal in the corner, could see him reaching for his radio to report this development up the chain of command. But the chain of command was the problem. Mercer had already said that Victoria Chen had connections inside the prosecutor's office. How far did those connections extend? Who else had been compromised? Sarah stood and crossed to the marshal, speaking quietly so Mercer could not hear. I need you to lock down this room. No calls in or out until I say otherwise. And I need you to contact Deputy Chief Morrison, no one else. Tell him I need an off-book team assembled in the next 30 minutes. People I can trust absolutely. The marshal hesitated. Lieutenant, this is a federal case. I cannot just... Sarah cut him off with a look that had stopped suspects in their tracks. This is about a 17-year-old girl being used as a hostage to obstruct justice. You can either help me save her, or you can explain to your superiors why you stood by and did nothing. Your choice. The marshal held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. What about the witness? Sarah glanced back at Mercer, who was watching the exchange with desperate attention. He stays here under your protection. If anyone tries to move him, anyone at all, you contact me immediately. And keep your radio traffic to a minimum. We do not know who is listening. 32 minutes later, Sarah stood in a parking garage beneath the county administrative building, surrounded by 3 of the most trustworthy officers she had ever worked with. Detective James Okonkwo was a 15-year veteran of the Homicide Division, a former Army Ranger with a reputation for unshakable calm under pressure. Officer Maria Santos had been Sarah's partner in the K-9 unit before transferring to narcotics, her instincts nearly as sharp as Max's, and Sergeant William Pike was a grizzled patrol supervisor who had forgotten more about Atlanta's criminal underground than most detectives would ever learn. They were an unlikely team, assembled on a short notice with no official sanction, but Sarah trusted each of them with her life. She briefed them quickly, laying out everything Mercer had told her: the conspiracy, Victoria Chen, the missing daughter, the threat that extended far beyond Marcus Webb and his construction company. When she finished, the silence in the parking garage was heavy with the weight of what she was asking them to do. Pike spoke first, his voice gravelly from 30 years of cigarettes and midnight shifts. You are talking about going after one of the most connected women in Atlanta. If this blows up, we are all looking at career-ending consequences. Maybe worse. Sarah nodded. I know. That is why I'm not ordering anyone to do anything. This is voluntary. If you want to walk away, no hard feelings. But I am going after that girl, with or without help. Okonkwo cracked his knuckles, a habit Sarah remembered from their academy days. What is the play? Sarah had been thinking about that during the drive over. Turning the problem over in her mind like a puzzle she was determined to solve. The first priority is locating Emily Mercer. She was photographed in Midtown 3 days ago, but she could be anywhere by now. We need to canvass the area, see if anyone remembers seeing her, check traffic cameras and security footage from nearby businesses. Santos raised her hand. I still have contacts in narcotics who owe me favors. Some of them work the Midtown corridor. If anyone unusual has been moving through the area, they might know. Good, Sarah said. Pike, I need you to reach out to your people on the street, low-level informants, anyone who might have heard whispers about a kidnapping or a high-value hostage situation. Keep it quiet. No official channels. Pike nodded. What about Victoria Chen? Sarah's jaw tightened. That is where things get complicated. We cannot move against her directly, not without evidence. But Mercer mentioned that she introduced him to Marcus Webb 15 years ago. That means there is history there, records, documentation. Okonkwo, I need you to dig into her background. Property records, corporate filings, anything that might give us a sense of where she might hide someone she did not want found. "And you?" Okonkwo asked. "What will you be doing?" Sarah looked down at Max, who sat patiently at her feet, awaiting her next command. "Max and I are going back to the courthouse. If Victoria Chen was really in that courtroom today, she left traces, scent, DNA, something Max can track. And if we can connect her to the man with the detonator, we have our first real piece of evidence." The team dispersed with quiet efficiency, each officer moving to their assigned task with the focused determination that separated good cops from great ones. Sarah returned to the courthouse through a side entrance, avoiding the media circus that had only grown larger in the 2 hours since the evacuation. The bomb squad had completed their sweep, finding no additional devices, but the building remained locked down pending further investigation. Sarah used her credentials to gain access, leading Max through the empty corridors toward the courtroom where everything had begun. The gallery was still cordoned off with yellow tape. The bench where the man in grey had been sitting now marked with evidence placards. Sarah led Max to the front row, to the seat where Mercer had said Victoria Chen had been watching with that terrible smile. She knelt beside the dog and spoke the command for tracking, a different syllable than the one used for explosives detection, one that activated a different set of instincts. Max's nose went to work immediately, sampling the air around the seat, the armrests, the floor beneath. He moved in slow circles, building a scent profile, filtering out the dozens of other people who had occupied this space during the morning session. It was painstaking work, requiring intense concentration from both dog and handler. But Sarah had faith in Max's abilities. He had tracked fugitives through crowds of thousands, had found missing children in wilderness areas where human searchers had given up hope. If Victoria Chen had left any trace of herself in this courtroom, Max would find it. The dog's behavior changed subtly, a slight shift in his body language that only someone who knew him intimately would recognize. He had the scent. Sarah followed as Max led her out of the gallery, through the main doors and into the corridor beyond. The trail was hours old, degraded by the passage of hundreds of feet and the mechanical circulation of air conditioning, but Max pursued it with unwavering focus, down the corridor, past the elevators, through a service door that led to a back stairwell. Sarah's hand moved to her weapon as they descended, senses alert for any sign of ambush. The stairwell was empty, their footsteps echoing off concrete walls, the air thick with the smell of old dust and industrial cleaner. Max led her down 2 flights, then pushed through a fire door into an underground parking level that Sarah had not known existed. The garage was vast and dimly lit, reserved for judges and senior court personnel. A handful of luxury vehicles occupied spaces near the elevator bank, but Max bypassed them entirely, heading toward the far corner where the lighting was poorest. Sarah followed, her eyes adjusting to the darkness, her instincts screaming that something was wrong. Max stopped at an empty parking space, his nose pressed to the concrete floor where tire marks indicated a recent departure. He looked up at Sarah with an expression she had learned to interpret over 7 years of partnership. "The trail ends here. Whoever it was, they are gone." Sarah knelt beside him, examining the floor for any evidence that might have been left behind. A scrap of paper caught her eye, wedged beneath a concrete parking barrier. She pulled on latex gloves and retrieved it carefully, holding it up to the dim light to read what was written there. It was a receipt from a parking validation machine, stamped with a time of 9:47 a.m., less than an hour before the trial was scheduled to begin. And in the corner, barely visible, a logo that Sarah recognized immediately. Foster and Associates. Someone from Victoria Chen's law firm had been in this garage, in this exact spot, on the morning of the attack. It was not proof of conspiracy, not enough to build a case, but it was a thread, and threads could be pulled. Sarah photographed the receipt and bagged it, then led Max back up the stairs and out of the courthouse. The afternoon sun was brutal, the heat index pushing well past 100 degrees, but Sarah barely noticed. Her mind was racing through possibilities, connections, next steps. She needed to reconnect with her team, share what she had found, coordinate their efforts before the trail went completely cold. Her phone buzzed with a text from Santos, possible lead. Witness saw girl matching description at construction site on Howell Mill, sending coordinates. Sarah's pulse quickened as she read the message. Howell Mill Road ran through a rapidly developing area of Midtown, full of half-finished buildings and abandoned lots. It was the perfect place to hide someone you did not want found. She loaded Max into the cruiser and headed north, weaving through traffic with lights and siren, every second feeling like a lifetime. The construction site was enormous, a planned mixed-use development that had stalled 6 months ago when the contractor ran out of funding. Chain-link fences surrounded the perimeter, adorned with faded signs from the various companies that had been involved in the project. One of those signs caught Sarah's eye as she pulled up to the gate. Meridian Construction Group, the same company at the center of the Webb trial, the same company that had built the parking structure that collapsed and killed 3 workers. The coincidence was too pointed to be accidental. Sarah parked outside the main entrance and approached on foot, Max padding silently at her side. The gate was secured with a heavy padlock, but a section of fencing nearby had been cut and folded back, creating an opening just large enough for a person to squeeze through. Fresh footprints in the dust led toward the skeleton of a half-finished building that rose 15 stories against the blazing sky. She radioed her position to dispatch, requesting backup while making clear that she was proceeding with the preliminary search. Protocol dictated that she wait for additional officers, but every instinct in her body was screaming that Emily Mercer was inside that building, that every minute of delay was a minute the girl might not have. She drew her weapon and slipped through the gap in the fence. Max moving ahead in tactical formation, his body low to the ground and his ears pricked forward. The ground floor of the building was a maze of concrete pillars and scattered construction debris. Dust hung thick in the air, disturbed by their passage, and the only light came from gaps in the temporary walls, where window frames had yet to be installed. Sarah moved carefully, checking corners and blind spots, relying on Max to alert her to any threats she might miss. The dog was in full working mode now, his playful personality subsumed by the focused intensity of a trained police K-9. They cleared the first floor without incident and began ascending a concrete staircase that zigged and zagged toward the upper levels. The higher they climbed, the more complete the construction became, with drywall panels and electrical wiring beginning to appear. On the 6th floor, Max stopped suddenly, his body going rigid in the characteristic point that indicated he had detected something significant. Sarah followed his gaze to a closed door at the end of a corridor, the only one on this level that had been fully installed. Light seeped from beneath it, artificial and yellowish, and she could hear the faint murmur of voices coming from inside. She approached slowly, keeping her weapon trained on the door, her back pressed against the wall to minimize her profile. Max moved with her, his breathing silent, his muscles coiled and ready. The voices became clearer as she drew closer. 2 distinct speakers, both male, discussing something in low, urgent tones. Sarah strained to make out the words, catching fragments about schedules and transfers, and a delivery that was supposed to happen at sundown. Then a third voice joined the conversation, higher and younger, quavering with fear. "Please," the voice said, "please, I just want to go home. Emily Mercer." Sarah did not hesitate. She kicked the door inward with all the force she could muster, sending it crashing off its hinges, and swept into the room with her weapon raised. 2 men in dark clothing spun toward her, reaching for guns they would never have time to draw. Max was already in motion, launching himself at the nearest threat with a snarl that echoed off the concrete walls. "Atlanta police!" Sarah shouted. "Do not move." The first man went down under Max's weight, his scream cut short as the dog's jaws clamped onto his forearm. The second man made a break for a window at the back of the room, but Sarah closed the distance before he could reach it, driving her elbow into his kidney and sending him crashing to the floor. She had him cuffed and secured in under 10 seconds. The motions so automatic, they required no conscious thought. Emily Mercer sat huddled in the corner, her wrists bound with zip ties, her face streaked with tears. She was younger than Sarah had expected, her features still soft with adolescence despite the terror in her eyes. Sarah crossed to her quickly, cutting the zip ties with a tactical knife and pulling the girl into a protective embrace. "You are safe now," she said. "I am Lieutenant Collins with the Atlanta Police Department. I'm going to get you out of here." Emily clung to her, sobbing with relief. "My dad," she managed. "They said they would kill my dad if I tried to escape." Sarah held her tighter. "Your dad is safe. He is under federal protection right now, and no one is going to hurt him. But I need you to be brave for just a little longer. Can you do that for me?" The girl nodded against her shoulder, drawing a shaky breath. Sarah helped her to her feet and guided her toward the door, stepping over the groaning body of the man Max had subdued. The dog released his grip at her command and fell into position beside them, blood staining his muzzle, but his eyes calm and watchful. Outside the room, Sarah heard the distant wail of sirens, backup finally arriving after what felt like hours but had been less than 15 minutes. They emerged from the building into the late afternoon sun, where a half-dozen patrol cars had formed a perimeter around the construction site. Sarah handed Emily off to a pair of paramedics who had arrived with the first responders, then turned to face Deputy Chief Morrison, who was striding toward her with an expression that mingled relief and fury in equal measure. "You went in alone," he said, "without backup, against every protocol we have." Sarah met his gaze without flinching. "I had Max." Morrison stared at her for a long moment, then shook his head with something that might have been admiration. "The two men you apprehended are being transported to Grady for medical evaluation. They are not talking, but we ran their prints and got hits on both. Former private military contractors linked to a security firm that has done work for several of Atlanta's largest law firms, including Foster and Associates." Sarah felt a grim satisfaction settle into her chest. She would need more than that to bring down Victoria Chen, but it was a start, and Mercer... Morrison glanced around to make sure no one was within earshot. "He is ready to testify. All of it. Names, dates, dollar amounts, everything. He said watching you go after his daughter changed something in him. Said if a cop and her dog could risk their lives for a stranger's child, then he had no right to protect himself at the expense of justice." The words struck Sarah with unexpected force. She looked down at Max, who sat patiently at her feet, tongue lolling from the exertion of the afternoon. He had no idea what he had accomplished today, no understanding of the ripples his actions had set in motion. He had simply done what he was trained to do, what his instincts demanded. He had protected, he had served, and in doing so, he had reminded a broken man what loyalty really meant. The next 12 hours passed in a blur of interviews, evidence processing, and urgent consultations with prosecutors who were scrambling to incorporate Mercer's expanded testimony into their case. The federal marshals had been blindsided by the revelation that their protective detail had been compromised, and a full internal investigation was already underway. Victoria Chen had not been seen since leaving the courthouse that morning, but APBs had been issued for her vehicle and known associates. The net was tightening. Sarah grabbed 3 hours of sleep in a break room at police headquarters. Max curled up on a blanket beside her desk. She woke to the sound of her phone buzzing with a text from Okonkwo. Property records showed that Victoria Chen owned a country estate in the hills north of the city, purchased 15 years ago through a shell company and never publicly linked to her name. It was the kind of place where someone could hide for weeks without being noticed, the kind of place where secrets went to die. She assembled her team in the pre-dawn darkness, adding a tactical unit from the department's Special Operations Division. They convoyed north on mostly empty highways, the city lights fading behind them as they entered the wooded foothills of the Appalachian Range. The estate was located at the end of a private road, screened from the main highway by a thick stand of pines, its entrance marked only by a simple stone pillar with no address or identification. Sarah led the approach on foot, leaving the vehicles a quarter-mile back to avoid alerting anyone inside. Max ranged ahead, his dark coat blending with the shadows beneath the trees, his nose working constantly to detect any threats. The house came into view gradually, a sprawling Georgian mansion with white columns and perfectly manicured grounds. Lights burned in several windows despite the early hour, suggesting occupancy. They split into 3 teams, moving to surround the house from multiple angles. Sarah took the rear entrance, a service door that led into the kitchen, with Max at her side and Okonkwo covering her back. The breach was textbook, swift and silent, coordinated across all entry points by radio countdown. In the confusion that followed, there was no time to think, only to act, as Sarah swept through room after room in search of their target. They found Victoria Chen in a study on the 2nd floor, surrounded by shredded documents and the acrid smell of burning paper. She was still feeding files into a fireplace when Sarah kicked in the door, and she looked up with an expression of such pure contempt that it stopped Sarah in her tracks for a single heartbeat. "You cannot touch me," Chen said, her voice as cold and polished as marble. "I have friends in places you cannot imagine. Judges, senators, people who could end your career with a single phone call. Whatever you think you have found, it will never see a courtroom." Sarah holstered her weapon and stepped closer, close enough to see the fear lurking beneath the woman's facade of control. "That is where you are wrong," she said, "because I do not need judges or senators. I have something better. I have a witness who is ready to tell the truth, a trail of evidence that leads directly to this house, and a 17-year-old girl who can testify that she was kidnapped on your orders. Your friends might be powerful, but they are not powerful enough to make all of that disappear." Chen's composure cracked for just an instant, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her perfect features. "You have no idea what you are dealing with," she said. "Webb was just the beginning. There are people involved in this who will not stop until everyone connected to that trial is silenced permanently." "Then give them up," Sarah said. "All of them. And maybe you can spend the rest of your life in a cell instead of a coffin." The standoff lasted less than 30 seconds. Victoria Chen was many things: a schemer, a manipulator, a woman who had built her career on the calculated destruction of others. But she was not stupid. She could see the walls closing in, could calculate the odds of escape and find them vanishingly small. When she finally nodded, it was with the bitter resignation of someone who understood that the game was over. The fallout from Victoria Chen's arrest dominated Atlanta news for weeks. Her testimony, combined with Daniel Mercer's expanded statement, exposed a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of city government. 3 city council members were indicted. The chief of police resigned amid allegations of bribery. 2 superior court judges were removed from the bench pending criminal investigations, and Marcus Webb, the man whose trial had started it all, pleaded guilty to avoid the risk of additional charges that would have kept him in prison until he was an old man. Sarah watched it all from a distance, returning to her regular duties with the K-9 unit as soon as the initial investigations were complete. She had never sought the spotlight, never wanted the recognition that came with breaking a case of this magnitude. What mattered to her was simpler and more fundamental. A girl had been saved. A witness had found the courage to tell the truth. Justice, imperfect and incremental, had been served. 3 weeks after the arrests, she received a handwritten letter delivered to her precinct by courier. The envelope bore no return address, only her name in elegant calligraphy. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 2 sentences written in the same careful hand. Max saw what others could not. Some debts can never be repaid. Sarah read the words twice, then folded the letter and slipped it into her pocket. She looked down at Max, who lay stretched out on the cool tile floor of her office. Eyes closed, paws twitching slightly as he chased rabbits through whatever dreams occupied his sleeping mind. He had no idea that he was a hero, no understanding of the lives he had changed or the future he had helped create. He was simply a dog, doing what dogs do, loving without condition, protecting without hesitation, living fully in each moment without fear of what might come next. She knelt beside him and ran her fingers through his fur, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath her palm. "Good boy," she whispered, "good boy." The summer heat began to break as August turned to September, thunderstorms rolling through the city each afternoon, leaving the air cleaner and the streets steaming. Sarah threw herself into training exercises and routine patrols, grateful for the normalcy after the intensity of the previous month. Max seemed to share her relief, his energy returning to its usual boundless enthusiasm, his tail wagging constantly as they worked through detection drills and obedience refreshers. On a Tuesday afternoon, as they were finishing a sweep of a downtown parking structure, Sarah's radio crackled with an urgent call. Armed robbery in progress at a jewelry store on Peachtree Street. Suspects fleeing on foot, possibly headed toward underground Marta Station. All available units respond. Sarah acknowledged the call and broke into a run, Max keeping pace beside her with effortless grace. The parking structure emptied onto a side street less than 2 blocks from the reported location, and she could already hear shouting and the wail of approaching sirens. Pedestrians scattered as she charged past, clearing a path with shouted commands and the unmistakable authority of her uniform. The suspects came into view as she rounded a corner, 2 men in dark hoodies sprinting toward the entrance of the Peachtree Center station. They had a significant lead, but Max was faster than any human could ever be. Sarah unclipped his leash and gave the command, watching as 70 pounds of muscle and determination exploded forward like a guided missile. The first suspect never saw him coming. Max hit him from behind, driving him to the pavement with bone-jarring force, jaws clamping onto the back of his jacket and pinning him in place. The second suspect spun at the sound of his partner's scream, eyes widening at the sight of the dog, and made the fatal mistake of reaching for his waistband. Sarah's tackle took him off his feet before his hand could close around the grip of the pistol, and she had him face down and cuffed before the first patrol car screeched to a halt beside them. The arrest was clean, the evidence overwhelming. Both suspects were found with stolen jewelry worth over $200,000 and handguns that traced back to a series of armed robberies stretching back 3 months. It was exactly the kind of case Sarah had joined the force to work. Straightforward bad guys doing straightforward bad things. No political complications or hidden conspiracies to navigate. She felt an unexpected surge of gratitude as she loaded Max back into the cruiser, grateful for the simplicity of it all. Her partner deserved a reward. She drove to a park on the outskirts of Midtown, a favorite spot with a fenced dog run and a creek where Max could splash and play off-leash. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grass as she released him from his harness, watching him bound toward the water with unbridled joy. For a few precious minutes, he was not a police K-9 or a hero or a weapon in the fight against crime. He was just a dog, reveling in the pure pleasure of being alive. Sarah sat on a bench overlooking the creek, letting the tension drain from her muscles. A gentle breeze carried the scent of coming rain, and she tilted her face toward the sky, eyes closed, breathing deeply. The past month felt like a fever dream now. The courthouse attack and the kidnapping and the conspiracy that reached into every corner of Atlanta's elite. She had done her job, followed the evidence where it led, and the system had ultimately worked. But she knew better than to believe that was the end of it. Men like Marcus Webb and women like Victoria Chen were symptoms of a deeper disease, manifestations of greed and corruption that had been festering for decades. Cutting out a few tumors did not cure the cancer. Max came bounding back from the creek, soaking wet and grinning with doggy delight. He shook himself vigorously, spraying Sarah with cold water, and she laughed despite herself. Whatever darkness lurked in the corners of Atlanta, whatever battles lay ahead, she would face them with this ridiculous, wonderful creature at her side. That was enough. It had to be. Her phone buzzed with a text from Deputy Chief Morrison. "Press conference tomorrow. Commissioner wants you there for commendation." Sarah read the message twice, then typed a brief reply declining the invitation. She had no interest in commendations or press conferences, no desire to stand at a podium while politicians took credit for work that had been done by cops in the trenches. Let Morrison represent the department. Let the commissioners have their photo ops. She had more important things to do. The next morning found her at the Fulton County Courthouse once again, this time in a very different capacity. Daniel Mercer was testifying in the first of what would be many trials spawned by the Webb investigation, and Sarah had been called as a witness to corroborate his account of the events that led to his expanded testimony. She wore her dress uniform, medals polished, hair secured in its regulation bun, Max waiting in an air-conditioned conference room with a handler from the K-9 unit. The courtroom was even more crowded than it had been on the day of the attack, every seat filled with reporters and lawyers and observers who had come to watch the dominoes fall. Sarah took her place on the witness stand and answered questions for 2 hours, methodically recounting every detail of her investigation, from the moment she entered the courthouse to the moment Victoria Chen was taken into custody. The defense attorneys tried to rattle her, searching for inconsistencies or procedural violations they could exploit, but Sarah had been through enough trials to know their tricks. She remained calm, precise, and utterly unflappable. When she finally stepped down from the stand, Mercer caught her eye from his seat at the prosecution table. He was a different man than the trembling wreck she had encountered in that conference room. His spine straight, his gaze steady, the weight of his guilt transformed into purpose. He nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had passed between them, and Sarah returned the gesture before walking out of the courtroom into the marble corridor beyond. Emily Mercer was waiting for her there, accompanied by her mother and a pair of federal marshals. The girl looked healthier than she had on the day of her rescue. Color returned to her cheeks, the haunted look in her eyes beginning to fade. She stepped forward as Sarah approached, hesitating for just a moment before throwing her arms around the lieutenant in a fierce embrace. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Sarah held her for a long moment, feeling the fragility and the strength that coexisted in this young survivor. "You do not need to thank me," she said. "Just live your life. Be happy. That is all the thanks I need." Emily pulled back, wiping her eyes, and managed a small smile. "Will you say goodbye to Max for me? He is the real hero, you know." Sarah smiled back. "I will tell him, but between you and me, he already knows." The Mercer family departed under heavy security, headed for a new life in a location that would never be disclosed. Sarah watched them go, then retrieved Max from the conference room and led him out of the courthouse through a back entrance, avoiding the crush of media that still swarmed the main doors. The afternoon was warm but pleasant, a breeze carrying the first hints of autumn through the downtown streets. She walked without destination, letting Max set the pace, enjoying the simple pleasure of movement and companionship. They ended up at Centennial Olympic Park, the broad plaza quiet in the mid-afternoon lull. Sarah found a shady spot beneath one of the massive sculptures and sat on a bench, Max stretching out at her feet with a contented sigh. The city hummed around them, traffic and construction, and the endless pulse of human activity. But here in this moment, there was only stillness. A woman approached from the direction of the CNN center, walking with purpose towards Sarah's bench. She was in her 50s, elegantly dressed, her grey hair cut short in a professional style. Something about her bearing suggested authority, the kind of quiet power that came from years of wielding influence in rooms where decisions were made. Sarah tensed, her hand moving instinctively toward Max's harness, but the woman raised both hands in a gesture of peace. "Lieutenant Collins," she said, "my name is Margaret Holloway. I work for the United States Attorney's Office, and I have been following your work on the Webb case with great interest. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" Sarah studied her for a long moment, reading her body language, searching for signs of deception. The woman's gaze was direct and unafraid, her posture relaxed but purposeful. Whatever she wanted, it was not a trap. Sarah gestured to the bench beside her. "Have a seat." Holloway sat, crossing her legs with the practiced elegance of someone who had spent decades in courtrooms and conference rooms. She reached into her bag and produced a slim manila folder, which she placed on the bench between them. "What you uncovered goes far beyond Atlanta," she began. "Victoria Chen was a regional node in a national network of corruption that extends into every major city on the eastern seaboard. Money laundering, bid rigging, witness tampering, obstruction of justice. We have been trying to map this network for years, but every time we get close, the key witnesses either disappear or recant their testimony." Sarah glanced at the folder but did not pick it up. "And you think what happened here is going to change that?" Holloway smiled, a thin expression that held no warmth. "I think Daniel Mercer is the first witness in the history of this investigation who has survived long enough to testify in open court. And I think that happened because of you and your K-9 partner. We have resources that local law enforcement cannot access. Federal task forces, witness protection programs with teeth, prosecutors who specialize in RICO cases. But what we do not have is someone on the ground who knows how these people operate, who can move through their networks without being detected, who has proven that she can break their hold over witnesses." Sarah understood now where this was going. She looked down at Max, who had lifted his head at the sound of her quickening heartbeat. "You are asking me to join a federal investigation." "I am asking you to consider it," Holloway said. "There would be risks, of course. The people we are targeting have resources that make Victoria Chen look like a small-time operator. They have corrupted federal agents, local police, judges at every level of the system. But we are building something different, a team that operates outside the normal chain of command, answerable only to a select group of prosecutors who have been vetted at the highest levels. You would have autonomy, resources, and the chance to take down an organization that has been poisoning this country for decades." Sarah was silent for a long time, watching the pedestrians pass by on the paths that wound through the park. She had never thought of herself as someone who sought glory or advancement. She had joined the force because she believed in protecting people, in standing between the innocent and those who would harm them. The K-9 unit had been her home for 7 years. Max, her constant companion, their work together more fulfilling than anything she had ever experienced. But Holloway's words had planted a seed that she could not ignore. The corruption she had uncovered in Atlanta was not an isolated case. It was part of something larger, something systemic, something that would continue to claim victims unless someone had the courage to tear it out by the roots. She thought of Emily Mercer, alone and terrified in that half-finished building. She thought of the 3 workers who had died when the parking structure collapsed. She thought of all the victims she would never know. The lives destroyed by greed and complicity, and the willingness of ordinary people to look the other way. "I will think about it," she said finally. Holloway nodded and rose from the bench. The folder contains everything you need to know. Read it when you are ready. And, Lieutenant, she paused, looking back over her shoulder, what you did here mattered. Not just for this case, but for every case that comes after. People like you are rare. It would be a shame to see that potential wasted on traffic stops and petty criminals. She walked away without waiting for a response, disappearing into the crowd of tourists and office workers that flowed through the park. Sarah sat for a long while after she was gone, the manila folder heavy in her lap, Max's warm presence steady at her side. The sun began its descent toward the western skyline, painting the clouds in shades of gold and crimson, and still she sat, thinking about choices and consequences and the roads that stretched ahead. That night, alone in her apartment with Max curled up on the couch beside her, Sarah opened the folder and began to read. The documents inside painted a picture of corruption so vast and entrenched that it seemed almost impossible to comprehend. Names she recognized from national news, corporations she had assumed were pillars of legitimate commerce, government officials who had sworn oaths to serve the public trust. All of them connected by threads of money and favors and shared complicity, all of them protected by a system designed to ensure that the powerful remained powerful and the truth remained hidden. The weight of it pressed down on her, heavy as stone. She was one person, one cop with a dog, trying to make sense of a conspiracy that spanned decades and crossed every boundary she had ever been taught to respect. What could she possibly accomplish against enemies like these? What difference could one woman and one K-9 make against an organization that had corrupted the very institutions meant to bring it to justice? Max lifted his head and rested it on her thigh, amber eyes gazing up at her with uncomplicated trust. She stroked his ears absently, feeling the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. He did not understand the documents in her lap or the impossible choices that lay ahead. He understood only this moment, this connection, the simple truth of their partnership. And maybe that was enough. Sarah closed the folder and set it aside. She would make her decision tomorrow, or the next day, or whenever the moment felt right. For now, she would sit with her dog in the quiet of her apartment and let the city carry on without her. The battles could wait. The corruption would still be there when she was ready to fight it. Tonight, there was only this. The autumn deepened, leaves turning gold and crimson on the trees that lined Atlanta's residential streets. Sarah returned to her regular duties, throwing herself into the work with renewed dedication, while the question of Holloway's offer remained unresolved in the back of her mind. She trained with Max every day, honing skills that had grown slightly rusty during the intensity of the Webb investigation. They worked detection scenarios, tracking exercises, controlled aggression drills that tested the limits of their partnership. Whatever came next, they would be ready. The trials continued through October and November, each one chipping away at the foundations of the network Victoria Chen had helped to build. Marcus Webb received a sentence of 35 years. Chen herself was sentenced to life without parole, her connections insufficient to save her from the weight of evidence that had been assembled against her. The corrupt city council members, the judges, the police officials, all of them fell like dominoes, their careers and their freedom sacrificed on the altar of their own greed. Sarah was called to testify in several of these proceedings, each appearance taking her deeper into the heart of the conspiracy she had helped expose. She saw things that disturbed her, connections that reached farther than she had imagined, evidence that suggested the corruption extended well beyond Atlanta's borders. By the time the last trial concluded in early December, she had reached a decision. She called Margaret Holloway on a Thursday afternoon, standing on the rooftop of her apartment building while Max explored the potted plants that her neighbor maintained in a futile attempt to create a garden in the sky. The federal prosecutor answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and businesslike. "I am in," Sarah said. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "You have read the file. You understand what you are agreeing to. I understand that there are people out there hurting innocent victims, and I have the skills to stop them. That is all I need to know." Holloway's voice softened almost imperceptibly. "Report to our Atlanta field office on Monday morning. Bring your partner. We have a case that requires exactly your talents." Sarah ended the call and looked out over the city that had been her home for her entire career. The skyline glittered in the fading light, towers of glass and steel rising above streets where she had chased suspects and saved lives and learned what it meant to be a cop. She did not know what the future held, did not know if she was making the right choice or walking into a darkness from which she might never emerge. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Max would be beside her, and as long as that was true, she could face whatever came next. The weekend passed in a blur of preparations, paperwork, and quiet farewells. Sarah met with Deputy Chief Morrison to discuss her temporary reassignment to the federal task force, carefully navigating the political sensitivities that such a move entailed. Morrison was supportive but cautious, warning her that federal agencies played by different rules, and that the interagency rivalries could be even more vicious than the criminals they pursued. She thanked him for his concern and promised to keep him informed of any developments that affected Atlanta's interests. On Sunday night, she packed a go-bag with everything she might need for extended travel and stored it by the front door. Max watched the preparations with alert curiosity, sensing that something significant was changing in their routine. Sarah knelt beside him and took his face in her hands, looking into his amber eyes with the affection she rarely allowed herself to express in words. "New adventure, buddy," she said. "You ready?" Max's tail wagged once, a decisive thump against the hardwood floor. "Good boy." Monday morning dawned clear and cold. The first frost of the season silvering the grass in the park across from Sarah's apartment. She loaded Max into her personal vehicle, leaving the departmental cruiser behind, and drove through empty streets toward the federal building where Holloway's task force maintained its headquarters. The security checks took longer than expected, but by 9 o'clock she was standing in a conference room on the 12th floor, surrounded by strangers who would become her new colleagues. Holloway made the introductions with characteristic efficiency. The team was small, only 8 people including Sarah, but each member brought specialized skills that complemented the others. There was a forensic accountant who could trace money through a dozen shell companies without breaking a sweat. A surveillance specialist who had spent 15 years with the NSA before burning out on the bureaucracy. A prosecutor with a perfect record in organized crime cases, and 3 other field agents, all of them veterans of high-risk operations with backgrounds that ranged from military special forces to undercover narcotics work. Sarah was the only K-9 handler, the only local law enforcement officer, and the only person in the room who had never worked a federal case. But Holloway had recruited her for a reason. And that reason became clear as the prosecutor began outlining their current target. The case centered on a shipping company operating out of the port of Savannah, less than 3 hours from Atlanta. On the surface, coastal maritime logistics appeared to be a legitimate enterprise, moving containers of consumer goods between the United States and Asia. But intelligence developed over several years suggested that the company was actually a front for a vast smuggling operation, bringing in everything from counterfeit electronics to fentanyl precursor chemicals. The company's ownership structure was deliberately opaque, hidden behind layers of shell corporations registered in 6 countries. But financial traces linked it to several of the same networks that Victoria Chen had operated within, suggesting that the corruption Sarah had exposed in Atlanta was just one branch of a much larger tree. The challenge was evidence. Every time federal investigators got close to developing a case, witnesses disappeared or recanted, documentation was destroyed, and the company's lawyers tied the prosecution in procedural knots that could take years to untangle. They needed someone who could operate on the ground, develop intelligence from unconventional sources, and provide the kind of tactical flexibility that a team of suits and accountants could not. "That is where you come in," Holloway said, turning to Sarah. "Max has capabilities that our other assets lack. His detection skills could help us identify exactly what they are smuggling and where they are hiding it. And your experience with witness development could be invaluable in turning insiders who might otherwise remain silent." Sarah studied the briefing materials, her mind already working through possibilities and obstacles. "How deep is the corruption in local law enforcement?" "Deep enough that we cannot trust anyone in the Savannah PD or the surrounding county sheriff's offices," Holloway replied. "The FBI field office has 2 agents we believe are clean, but we are keeping even them at arm's length until we have a better sense of the infiltration. For this phase of the investigation, you will be operating with our team only." The weight of the assignment settled onto Sarah's shoulders like a familiar burden. She was being asked to walk into hostile territory, surrounded by enemies she could not identify, with only Max and a handful of federal agents as backup. It was exactly the kind of situation she had been trained to handle. "When do we start?" Holloway smiled, the expression carrying something that might have been approval. "Tomorrow morning. We have a surveillance position set up near the port. I will have someone brief you on the technical details this afternoon. But, Lieutenant?" She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a register that demanded attention. "This is not Atlanta. These people have no hesitation about killing federal officers, let alone local cops who get in their way. Watch your back." Sarah nodded. "That is what Max is for." The surveillance position was a rented warehouse less than a mile from the port's main entrance, equipped with long-range cameras and electronic intercept equipment that Sarah did not pretend to understand. She spent the first week observing, learning the rhythms of the port's operations, identifying the key personnel at Coastal Maritime Logistics. Max accompanied her on carefully planned circuits of the surrounding area, his nose cataloguing the scents that drifted from the shipping containers, building a baseline against which future deviations could be measured. The work was tedious but necessary, the kind of patient intelligence gathering that formed the foundation of any successful investigation. Sarah fell into a routine, morning briefings with the team followed by hours of observation and documentation, evenings spent analyzing the data they had collected. She slept in a hotel near the warehouse, Max on the bed beside her, dreams full of shipping containers and encrypted communications and the faces of criminals she had not yet identified. The breakthrough came on the 9th day, during a routine sweep of the perimeter road that circled the port's eastern edge. Max was working off-leash, ranging ahead with the focused intensity that signified active detection, when he suddenly froze and pointed toward a stack of containers near the water's edge. Sarah approached cautiously, radio in hand, eyes scanning for any sign of security patrols. The container Max had identified was unremarkable, a standard 40-foot unit painted in the colors of a Chinese shipping company, but something inside had triggered his alert, and Sarah had learned never to doubt his instincts. She photographed the container's identification number and called for extraction, leading Max back to the warehouse by an indirect route that minimized their exposure. The forensic accountant traced the container to a shipment that had arrived 3 days earlier from Vietnam, officially manifested as consumer electronics destined for a distribution center in Memphis. But cross-referencing with satellite imagery and shipping records revealed anomalies, timing inconsistencies that suggested the manifest had been falsified. Whatever was in that container, it was not televisions and smartphones. They needed to get inside. The discussion that followed was heated, with the surveillance specialist arguing for patience while the former Special Forces agent pushed for immediate action. Holloway listened to both sides before rendering her verdict. They would wait for the container to be moved off-site, then intercept it at a location where they had better control of the environment. The risk of a confrontation at the port itself was too high. Too many variables, too many ways for things to go wrong. The container was loaded onto a truck 2 days later, part of a convoy heading north on Interstate 16. Sarah followed at a distance in an unmarked vehicle, Max riding in the back seat, while the rest of the team coordinated through encrypted communications. The convoy's destination turned out to be a warehouse complex outside of Statesboro, about an hour from the coast, an industrial area surrounded by farmland and accessible only by a single 2-lane road. They hit the convoy just as it was turning into the warehouse complex, blocking the road with their vehicles and moving in with weapons drawn. The drivers surrendered without resistance, and the warehouse workers fled at the first sign of federal badges. Within 20 minutes, the complex was secured, and the team had full access to its contents. The container Max had identified held 300 kilograms of fentanyl precursor chemicals, enough to produce millions of lethal doses of the drug that had been ravaging American communities for years. But that was only the beginning. A systematic search of the warehouse revealed a sophisticated operation. Packing equipment for converting the raw chemicals into finished product, distribution manifests covering half the southeastern United States, and records that linked the operation to banks and law firms and shipping companies across the region. Sarah worked alongside the team through the night, cataloging evidence and securing the scene for the forensic specialists who would follow. Max stayed at her side, calm and patient, his presence a steady anchor in the chaos of the operation. By dawn, they had enough to bring charges against a dozen individuals and freeze assets totaling more than $50 million. It was a significant victory, a major blow against an organization that had operated with impunity for years. But Sarah knew it was not enough. The people at the top of the network, the ones who had ordered the shipments and collected the profits and corrupted the officials who looked the other way, remained beyond their reach. They were protected by layers of intermediaries and legal firewalls, insulated from the consequences of their actions by the very system that was supposed to bring them to justice. She said as much to Holloway during the debrief that followed, voicing her frustration with the limits of what they had accomplished. The prosecutor listened without interrupting, then nodded slowly. "You are right," Holloway said. "This was a skirmish, not a battle. The real targets are still out there, and they will adapt to what happened here. They will find new routes, new methods, new people to corrupt. But every operation like this gives us more intelligence, more leverage, more opportunities to turn insiders against their employers." "The war is long, Lieutenant. We measure progress in years, not weeks." Sarah understood the logic, but it did not make the reality any easier to accept. She returned to the hotel that night exhausted and discouraged. Max curled up beside her on the bed, his warmth a small comfort against the cold arithmetic of systemic corruption. The next morning brought an unexpected development. One of the warehouse workers they had detained, a young man named Luis Vargas, had asked to speak with the woman who handled the dog. Sarah entered the interrogation room with Max at her heel, uncertain what to expect, and found herself facing a terrified 23-year-old who had stumbled into the drug trade through a combination of desperation and bad choices. Vargas told her his story in halting English, how he had taken the warehouse job to support his pregnant girlfriend, how he had not known what was really being shipped until it was too late, how the threats against his family had kept him silent, even as his conscience screamed for him to come forward. He had watched the news coverage of the Webb trial in Atlanta, had seen the interviews with Emily Mercer and her family, had heard about the K-9 officer who had broken the case. "You saved that girl," he said, "and then you came here. I thought maybe you could help me too." Sarah listened without judgment, recognizing the pattern she had seen so many times before. The network survived by trapping ordinary people in webs of debt and fear, exploiting their vulnerabilities until they had no choice but to comply. Breaking free required courage that most people could not muster alone. But sometimes, with the right support, miracles happened. She made a decision in that moment, one that would shape the next phase of her life. She promised Vargas that if he cooperated fully, if he told her everything he knew about the operation and the people who ran it, she would do everything in her power to protect him and his family. It was not a guarantee she had the authority to make, but she made it anyway. Because sometimes doing the right thing meant taking risks that bureaucracies could never sanction. Vargas talked for 3 hours, providing names and dates and operational details that filled gaps in their intelligence picture. He described the chain of command above the warehouse level, identified the middlemen who coordinated between the smugglers and the distributors, and revealed the existence of a shadow banking network that moved money between accounts faster than regulators could track. Most importantly, he named the person at the top of the regional operation, a man he had never met, but whose reputation cast a long shadow over everyone who worked in the trade. The name was Thomas Blackwell, and he was one of the most respected businessmen in the Southeast. Sarah recognized the name immediately. Blackwell ran a conglomerate that included commercial real estate, hospitality ventures, and a string of legitimate import-export companies. He was a fixture of Atlanta society, a major donor to both political parties, a member of boards and councils that shaped policy at the state and national level. The idea that he could be connected to fentanyl trafficking seemed absurd, a conspiracy theory born from a desperate man's imagination. But Vargas's account was too detailed, too internally consistent to dismiss. He described payments routed through Blackwell's companies, meetings held at properties Blackwell owned, orders that came down through channels that led inexorably back to the businessman's inner circle. If even half of what he said was true, then the corruption Sarah had uncovered in Atlanta was merely the visible tip of an iceberg that reached deep into the foundations of regional power. She brought the information to Holloway, expecting skepticism, but finding instead a grim satisfaction. "We have suspected Blackwell for years," the prosecutor said, "but he is insulated by so many layers that we have never been able to build a case. If your witness can testify to direct connections, it changes everything." The investigation shifted into a new phase, one that would consume the next several months. Sarah became the primary handler for Luis Vargas, managing his transition into witness protection while extracting every piece of useful information he possessed. She traveled between Savannah and Atlanta, coordinating with the federal team while maintaining her cover as a routine K-9 officer on loan to a joint task force. Max accompanied her everywhere, his presence both a comfort and a tactical asset. His instincts serving as an early warning system against the threats that lurked in every shadow. Winter gave way to spring, and spring to summer, as the case against Thomas Blackwell slowly took shape. The evidence they gathered was circumstantial but damning, a pattern of transactions and communications that painted a picture of a man who had built his fortune on the suffering of others. Blackwell's lawyers fought every subpoena and challenged every witness, deploying the unlimited resources at their clients' disposal to delay and obstruct at every turn. But the team persisted, driven by the knowledge that failure would mean more deaths, more shattered families, more communities destroyed by the poison flowing through Blackwell's networks. The climax came on a September morning, exactly 1 year after Sarah had accepted Holloway's offer in that Atlanta park. A federal grand jury had returned a sealed indictment against Thomas Blackwell and 17 co-conspirators, and teams of agents were positioned across the southeast to execute simultaneous arrests. Sarah was assigned to the primary target, her role to accompany the tactical team that would take Blackwell into custody at his estate outside of Atlanta. The approach was tense, vehicles moving through pre-dawn darkness toward a compound protected by walls and gates and security systems that rivaled many government installations. But they had planned carefully, coordinating with technical specialists who had spent weeks mapping the defenses and identifying vulnerabilities. At exactly 6 o'clock, the gates were breached and the teams moved in. Sarah entered the main house behind the tactical operators, Max at her side, weapon drawn and senses on high alert. The resistance was minimal, Blackwell's security force standing down when confronted with the overwhelming force of the federal operation. Within minutes, they had the main target secured, a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and the imperious manner of someone accustomed to command. He looked at Sarah with contempt as she approached, his gaze flicking dismissively over her uniform and her dog. "You have no idea what you have done," he said. "I have friends who will bury you." Sarah met his eyes without flinching. "I have heard that before." They led him out of the house in handcuffs, past the swimming pool and the tennis courts and the gardens maintained by a staff of 12. The morning sun was breaking over the tree line, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn. Sarah paused at the edge of the driveway, looking back at the mansion that had been built on blood and misery, and felt something shift inside her chest. It was not victory, not exactly. The trials would take years, the appeals even longer, and some of the guilty would inevitably escape justice through the loopholes that wealth and power created. But a blow had been struck, a message sent, a line drawn that could not be uncrossed. The network would survive in some form, adapting and evolving as criminal enterprises always did. But it would be weaker, more cautious, less able to operate with impunity. And she would be there, with Max at her side to fight whatever battles came next. The press coverage was intense in the weeks that followed. Cable news networks running continuous updates on the Blackwell case and its implications. Sarah avoided the spotlight as much as possible, declining interview requests and letting Holloway serve as the public face of the investigation. She had no interest in fame or recognition. What she wanted was simpler and more fundamental, the satisfaction of knowing that her work had made a difference. She took a week of leave after the arrests, returning to Atlanta with Max for some much-needed rest. They ran in Piedmont Park at dawn, swam in the lakes north of the city, explored hiking trails in the mountains where the first hints of autumn were beginning to touch the leaves. Max seemed to understand that they were on vacation, his usual working intensity replaced by a playful enthusiasm that reminded Sarah why she had fallen in love with him in the first place. On the last night of her leave, she received a call from an unknown number. She almost let it go to voicemail, but something made her answer. The voice on the other end was distorted, mechanically altered to prevent identification. "Lieutenant Collins," it said. "We have not met, but I have been following your career with great interest. You have accomplished remarkable things, but I wonder if you truly understand what you have started." Sarah's grip tightened on the phone. "Who is this?" "A friend," the voice replied. "Or perhaps an enemy. It depends entirely on the choices you make from here. Thomas Blackwell was a pawn, Lieutenant, a useful one, but expendable. The people he worked for are still out there, and they are very interested in the woman who brought him down." The line went dead before Sarah could respond. She stood in the darkness of her apartment for a long moment, heart pounding, mind racing through possibilities, a threat, a warning, an invitation. Max whined softly and pressed against her leg, sensing her agitation. She knelt and wrapped her arms around him, drawing comfort from his solid presence, his unwavering loyalty. Whatever came next, she would face it the same way she had faced everything else. One step at a time, one challenge at a time, with her partner at her side. The investigation was over, but the war continued, and Sarah Collins was just getting started. She rose the next morning with renewed purpose, packing her bag and loading Max into the car for the drive back to Savannah. The task force was assembling new cases, following threads that had emerged from the Blackwell prosecution, chasing leads that reached into places she had never imagined. The work was dangerous and often thankless, opposed by forces that seemed overwhelming in their scope and resources. But she had Max, and she had her training, and she had the unshakable conviction that what she was doing mattered, that every corrupt official exposed and every trafficking network disrupted made the world a little bit safer for the people who could not protect themselves. The road stretched ahead, long and uncertain, full of challenges she could not predict and enemies she could not see. But Sarah had never been afraid of hard roads. She had chosen this life, this mission, this partnership with the remarkable creature who rode beside her with tongue lolling and ears pricked forward. Together they would face whatever came next. The city fell away behind them, replaced by the rolling green of the Georgia countryside. Max curled up on the back seat and closed his eyes, content in the knowledge that wherever they were going together. Sarah reached back and rested her hand on his flank, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing. "Good boy," she whispered, "good boy." And the road carried them forward into whatever future awaited.